Remember that travel craze we saw back in 22 and 23? It felt like everyone and their Instagram feed was constantly on an airplane.
Oh, totally.
Well, we're diving into why things are looking a little different these days, and it's not as simple as just fewer suitcases. We're talking about a whole shift in how people are traveling.
Yeah, it's a whole different landscape out there now.
And this recent analysis we found, it's called From Boom to Balance, Navigating the Travel Slowdown. It's going to help us unpack it all.
Oh, interesting.
So it's easy to just think, oh, everyone's just decided to stay home. But this analysis, it kind of paints a more complicated picture, don't you think?
It really does. It's not just black and white, is it? The report, it's saying we're not exactly seeing a full-blown decline. It's more like things are leveling out.
Right.
You know, after that kind of crazy period we saw, almost like a return to, well, you could say pre-pandemic norms, but with like a few little interesting curveballs thrown in.
A return to normalcy, but with a twist. I like that. It's like, those old spy movies. You think you finally cracked the code, and bam, secret room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in this case, that secret room, it's full of all this data that shows us this is not just some temporary blip. Like, for example, the U.S. Travel Association. They came out and said that 2024, it started a bit softer compared to the travel frenzy of last year.
Right.
Seems like maybe the industry just needed to catch its breath a little, you know?
It does make sense when you think about it. I mean, we went from 0 to 100 real quick after those lockdowns finally ended.
Oh, yeah.
A breather was probably long overdue.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the thing is, this isn't just some American thing. This trend, it's global. Like the report, it specifically mentions what's happening over in Ireland with their tourism industry.
Really?
Even with flights and hotels being a bit cheaper this year, they're seeing a dip in bookings for tours and stuff, like up to 20% compared to last year, which is wild.
Wow. 20%. That's huge.
It is. So yeah, something's definitely going on, and it's impacting travelers and businesses all over the place.
Which makes understanding the why behind it all that much more important.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's ditch the surface and dive deep into some of the factors that are driving this change. It's like those moments in action movies,
Yeah.
where all the different plot lines suddenly start connecting.
Right.
And we've got a few of our usual suspects lined up already, right? Like take inflation, for example.
Yeah. I mean, it's everywhere. We're always hearing about it. But what does that actually look like in the world of travel these days?
It's a great question. And Deloitte and Skift, they've been doing a lot of research into this.
Okay.
And they found that all those rising costs, the ones we keep hearing about,
Yep.
they're definitely making people think twice about booking that next vacation.
Well, yeah, it's one thing to hear about it on the news, but then you go to actually book a flight and suddenly, bam, inflation is very real.
Exactly. And it's not just the flights either. Everything costs more now. And it all kind of feeds into this prediction from Skift Research about slower revenue growth in the travel industry for this year.
Makes sense.
People are being more careful with their money. And when budgets get tight, travel often becomes that luxury that gets cut first. Which brings us to suspect number 2, right? Accommodation costs. Those are a big one. And remember how we were talking about that Airbnb crackdown a while back?
Wow.
Like that whole thing with the Edinburgh Fringe Festival?
Right.
What felt like a local story sort of became this global wake-up call, didn't it?
It really did, because it highlighted this bigger trend that's been happening.
Yeah.
Destinations everywhere. We're starting to tighten up the rules around short-term rentals.
Right.
So what happens? Fewer options often lead to higher prices.
Of course.
And that impacts everyone's ability to afford a trip, not just the luxury travelers.
It's like trying to squeeze onto one of those tour buses when it's already sold out, Things get a little chaotic, but let's be honest. It's not always just a money thing when it comes to travel, is it? There are all these other things happening in the world, too. Like, I'm thinking about those global events that always seem to be unfolding. I mean, even setting aside the really heavy stuff, like the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, and those definitely have a huge impact on travel. But even thinking about things like, remember when we talked about the Euros and the Olympics?
Yeah.
You'd think those kinds of things would lead to more travel, right? But the analysis seems to suggest the opposite might be true.
It's interesting, right? Because you'd think a big sporting event would equal more travel. But actually, these things can sometimes cause a dip in travel to other destinations. Think about it this way.
Right.
Some people might stay home so they can watch all the games, right? While others might decide to use their whole travel budget to go to these big events.
Oh.
Which means other trips get put on hold.
So it's like a travel trade-off.
Yeah, exactly.
You pick your one big adventure for the year, and that's it. Okay, and speaking of things that can unexpectedly impact travel, U.S. elections.
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking about that. That's another big one. This is where I feel like those virtuoso findings are so interesting. Remember when we talked about their research on election years?
Yeah.
Well, they found a link between U.S. presidential elections and travel slowdowns.
Okay, so is this just a matter of people being glued to their TVs too much to even think about booking a trip? Or is there something more to it?
It's definitely more nuanced than that. It's more about uncertainty, I think. Like, the research, it suggests that all the unknowns around an election year, it can make people hesitate to commit to travel plans too far in advance. And get this, sales actually tend to spike the year before an election.
Oh, wow.
Like,
Really?
everyone's trying to squeeze in one last hurrah before things potentially change.
Wow. That is wild. Like everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see what happens.
Right.
Okay, so we've got economic concerns, we've got global events, we've even got political cycles, and all of it swirling around, impacting how people feel about traveling right now.
Exactly. And that is why understanding consumer confidence is so important. Remember that whole thing we were talking about with Ryanair?
Yeah.
About how they're seeing a huge decrease in travelers overall, but then this big surge in last-minute bookings?
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of consumer hesitancy in action right there. People are waiting till the very last second to see what deals they can find. Or to see if the world is still going to be there.
Yeah.
Right? So everyone wants to travel, but they're also a little, I don't know, wary of what might be around the corner.
Right.
Oh.
Well, okay, so it's official. This isn't just a temporary blip, right? This is like a whole bunch of different factors that are all coming together to create this big shift in travel. But before anyone listening out there hits the panic button and cancels their travel dreams altogether, let's talk about what we can actually do with all this information, right? Okay, so we've talked about how the travel world is looking a bit different now. But you know what I like about this whole analysis? It doesn't just dump all this info on us and then leave us hanging with a bunch of what ifs. It actually gives us some good advice. Like, okay, how do we make the most of this new reality?
Right. It's actually a pretty practical report when you get down to it.
Totally. It's about being smart, being strategic. One of the things that really stood out to me was this whole idea about diversification.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But it's not as simple as just offering budget options or anything, right?
Right.
It's more like thinking outside the box when it comes to travel.
It totally is.
Yeah.
Like, maybe instead of planning that one big trip every year, it's about shifting your mindset a little.
Okay.
Embracing shorter, more frequent adventures, you know?
Right.
Like a long weekend, but you're exploring some city that's close to home.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe even just doing a staycation.
Right.
But one that actually feels like a little adventure.
Yeah, yeah.
Something fun. Or even swapping a pricey flight for a good old-fashioned road trip, you know?
Oh, totally. Like, it reminds me of this one time I randomly stumbled upon this awesome pottery retreat. And it was only like a couple hours away from where I live. It wasn't even something I'd planned or anything. But because I was open to just like going with the flow,
Right.
it turned into this super memorable trip.
See, that's awesome. That's what it's all about. And this is what's kind of cool about this whole, I don't know, slowdown.
Yeah.
It forces you to be creative, right? Like discover new things.
Yes, exactly. And, speaking of adapting, the analysis really seems to emphasize flexible booking, which, makes sense in this day and age, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, flexibility is key, right? Especially when there's so much uncertainty around travel.
Yeah.
Like offering things like, really good cancellation policies or being flexible with the dates people can travel, maybe even travel credits, so people can use them on a future trip. Those can make a huge difference for travelers.
Right.
Especially the ones who are kind of on the fence about committing to a trip. It builds trust.
Yeah.
Like you get them, you understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, totally. It's like, I don't know if you remember this, but remember when all those airlines started waiving their change fees? We all kind of breathed this collective sigh of relief.
Right.
It just made things so much less stressful.
It did.
Okay, now here's one thing that kind of surprised me in the analysis. Did you notice how it mentioned that business travel is actually increasing right now?
Yeah.
That seems a little counterintuitive with everything else going on.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But then when you actually stop and think about it, it kind of makes sense. Like we've been doing this remote work thing, all these Zoom meetings for years now. And I think people are starting to realize that there's really no substitute for that face-to-face connection.
Totally.
Especially when it comes to building those solid relationships.
Yeah.
Or like closing those really important business deals. You got to meet in person for that sometimes.
There's nothing quite like that human connection. And you know what else is huge when it comes to making people feel connected? That good old-fashioned, excellent customer
Oh,
service.
for sure.
Which, by the way, just happens to be another key takeaway from this whole analysis.
It's more important now than ever, I think. Travelers have so many choices these days,
Oh, yeah.
and everyone's watching what they spend more carefully.
Right.
So those moments where you can provide a really good experience, where it feels personalized,
Right.
like those are the things that can tip the scales for people,
Yeah.
make the difference between a forgettable trip and one that they're going to remember for years to come.
Exactly. Like, remember that time we were talking about when a hotel remembers your name?
Yes.
Or you have a tour guide who goes above and beyond. It just makes you feel good and you remember it.
Absolutely. Those are the kind of things that make you actually want to get out there and travel the world. No matter what the economy is doing or what crazy thing is happening in the world, those experiences stick with you.
So to kind of bring it all home today, I think what we've uncovered here is that this travel slowdown, yeah, it might feel a little bumpy right now, but maybe it's not such a bad thing after all. Like maybe it's a chance for everyone, travelers, people in the industry, everyone to kind of hit the reset button,
Yeah,
rethink what really matters,
totally.
maybe even rediscover the simple joy of getting out there and exploring,
I love that.
but doing it in a way that feels a little more mindful, a little more meaningful, I think.
Yeah, it's all about being adaptable, being creative, and maybe, just maybe, being a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty.
Well said. And who knows, this whole shift that's happening, it might actually lead to a better travel experience for everyone in the long run.
I think so too. I really do.
Excellent. Well, thanks for diving into all this with me today.
This was great. I always love our chats.
Me too. And for everyone listening out there, as always, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Happy travels, everyone.